Well, good morning. Good morning. How was our weekend? Good, good. We're here. Good. All right. I'll take it. I'll take it. Okay. So I just wanted to review a little bit, right? So we spent the last 2 weeks going over the three big types of arguments for God's existence. But as I said on Thursday, there's still a lot more to discuss, right? A lot of different things that are used to argue for God's existence. So we started off with the cosmological argument. Then we talked about teleological and ontological. This week, we are talking about miracles, which you can consider to be part of the religious experience arguments for God's existence, right? So people who have miraculous religious experiences, right, typically use those experiences, those miraculous events, as evidence for God's existence. Right. And so the reason that this didn't count as one of the three previous ones is because it uses a very specific type of approach, which is, again, this is like logic, critical thinking terminology I'm going to throw at you now, called inference to the best explanation, or what we call IBE. Okay, so you guys use this type of reasoning all the time, right? So imagine you were going to start your car one morning, right? Or, if you have a car, imagine you were going to start that car in the morning and it wouldn't start for some reason, right? There could be lots of different reasons for why it doesn't start, right? And you could do a sort of process of elimination to figure out what you think the best explanation is, right? For why the car didn't begin. But here's the problem with inference to the best explanation. It is only an inductive type of reasoning. So this is going back to our beginning of the class, the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. Anyone remember why induction is less reliable in terms of reasoning than deductive? Last part, yeah.
Okay,
So
okay.
even if the premises are true, right, even in the best possible case, you're exactly right. They only provide probable support, right, for the conclusion. So even if the premises are true, they do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, which again already shows us one of the biggest problems in using IBE to then reason from a miracle or a religious experience to God's existence, right? Because the idea is you're saying, well, God's existence is the best explanation for this, therefore that being must exist, right? But so there's going to be a lot of criticism of IBE that has nothing to do with its use in arguments for God, right? It's just as a type of reasoning, it's flawed, right? So the idea is some basic criticisms of IBE. Well, one, who knows if you've already considered all of the possible explanations to begin with, right? Before you did your process of elimination, maybe there was one you didn't consider, right? So maybe the explanation you think is the best is only the best of the ones you considered, right? But there could be a better explanation out there that you have not yet considered, right? And again, because of the fallibility of the human mind, even if something appears to be the best, and again, what constitutes best, right? That's going to be a whole nother question. But even if you have something that is the best, it doesn't automatically make it true, right? Even if something is the best explanation for something, that is not necessarily going to indicate that it must exist, right? Again, it's only providing that probable possibility of being the case. Okay, so this is the type of experience or argumentation that's going to be used, right? So little forewarning on the approach, right? This is not a deductive argument, right? So it's different from the last three categories that we looked at, right? Those were all attempts at deductive arguments. They were trying to guarantee the truth of their conclusion beyond a doubt. This approach, off the bat, not going to provide that sort of certainty, right? So it's a whole other category. Then we have to define some terms, though, right? Because we want to know exactly what we mean by a religious experience, but in this case, we're going to focus on things that we call miracles, right? Something that is a miraculous phenomena or event. So for those of us who at least took a peek at the PowerPoint, if nothing else, we should be aware that there are at least two different ways we can understand the word miracle, right? And we can call those a strong or a weak version of the word. So who can tell me what the difference is between weak understanding of miracle or a strong understanding of miracle? Even if you can only get one of them, that's good.
Okay, okay.
That's the strong one, is that it is a violation of a law of nature, right? That there are laws of nature that govern how every physical thing in the world operates, right? And that a miracle is God's intervention, right, in those laws to make things behave otherwise, right? So it's violating the law, right? So examples of this would be like, yeah, turning water into wine, unless you're an alchemist and you think that's within the realm of possibilities for the laws of nature, right? Walking on water, right? Resurrection of the dead, right? These types of things would count as strong miracles, right? Violating laws of nature. The weak sense, though, is something else. What's the weak sense? Maybe think of some of the things that people call miracles, and you're like, but is that really a miracle? Violate a law of nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So yeah, the idea is that this is already within the realm of possibility, but it's something that we think is like so unlikely, right? It's so like it couldn't be a coincidence, right? It's just this unlikely thing, this super unlikely thing that happens. So maybe you think of like those videos where, a car just like barely just inches by hitting somebody, right? Like it's so close, right? Exactly, right? It's just these things fall into place. Everything happens at the right moment, right? So it's these really unlikely, unexpected things that typically we think of as good, right? We don't typically ascribe miracles to those negative instances, right? Then for some reason, even Christians like to invoke karma. I'm not sure why, right? But the idea is that a miracle is this benefit, right? This value add, this protection, something about God's favoring us, right? And doing something to help us. So you might think of like, yeah, any close to death situation that someone narrowly escapes, right? But again, no violation of a law occurred, right? And so there are, of course, other sides of this that we're going to talk about, the negative things, right? What if the bad stuff that happens is God intervention too? We're going to get to that, right? So like when a tree falls on a car, right? And that car just happened to be full of a family that just came from church. Like, is that is God saying something? Did God choose to drop the tree on that particular vehicle? Was that not a miracle, right? As opposed to the other car, right? So what do we make of the bad things, the evil things? We will get to those, right? That's next week. That's the problem of evil. But this week we're focusing on those things that are typically seen as some bestowal of God's love, right? And protection, right, of people. So intervening on our behalf, right, in some sort of positive way. And so in this case, a lot of times you get what people call medical miracles, right? Things that maybe science cannot explain, right, tend to be thrown into what we might consider to be weak notions of the miraculous. Again, it's not that it's violated a law of nature, right? Especially if it's happened enough, right? A violation of a law of nature by its very essence should be rare, right? That's the whole point, is that laws of nature are about patterns. So if the law is getting violated all the time, then we might as well rewrite the law. The law is inaccurate, right? So the idea is that these things are supposed to be rare. So it's things when people say like someone just, they recovered and the chances were really bad, right? They had almost no chance of recovering, but they did. They haven't violated a law of nature. It's just that the odds were against them, right? It was just this extremely unlikely thing. Okay, so different senses of the word miraculous. Which ones are philosophers going to be concerned with? The weak sense or the strong sense? We're already dealing with inductive reasoning here, right? So weak miracles are going to provide little to no inductive support, right, for the existence of God. So only strong claims of miracles, right, are going to be considered here as potential evidence for God's existence. And again, only insofar as God's existence is the best explanation for those things. Okay, good. So what we have this week then are a number of readings, right? So just to introduce again this notion of miracles and how we're understanding them, you're going to see arguments for miracles, primarily from Richard Swinburne. He's the big philosopher of religion currently. I think he's still alive. Who I've actually met him. He's a very tall, gangly man. It's really funny because he goes rock climbing with other philosophers who are atheists. I'm sorry, I love nerd gossip. Like, how people like fangirl out like about celebrities when I hear weird things about philosophers. It makes them more real, But like he goes rock climbing with this really well-known atheist philosopher, and they have a rule that as soon as they get to the rocks, they don't talk about God anymore. Right, so it's possible we can be friends with right people who disagree with us, even if we've built our whole careers on that disagreement. But so Swinburne is going to be giving some really compelling, what are currently considered the most compelling, right, arguments based on inference to the best explanation, right? So he's going to give you some hypothetical scenarios, right? How can we actually rationally arrive at the conclusion that God is the best explanation, right? How can we eliminate all the other possibilities? Okay. Then we're going to look at some arguments against miracles in two different senses. One is from Christine Overall. She's going to say that even if miracles occur, they don't count as evidence against or for God, right? And it's basically because of that thing I just said about miracles supposedly being very rare, right? The idea is that if all of these things that are claimed to be miracles are actually miracles, then they're not really that rare. So they don't really count as evidence for God. She's got some other compelling stuff in there. We'll go through that some more on Thursday. And Hume is going to be the big critique against the argument from miracles. And his critique, I think, is really interesting because it rests on two components. One is a rule of rationality, right, about proportioning. Hi, Cece. I know I'm typing. Are you going to join us? Say hello. This is Cece. Hello. You run away now. Run away. Okay. All right. Proportioning our beliefs to the evidence, right? And so for Hume, what that's going to mean is that if you see something you think is a miracle, you should compare that belief to all of your other beliefs, right? All the other experiences you've had. And of course, the idea is that the majority of your experiences are of not miracles, right? And so that should give us reason to doubt our experience of the miraculous, right? So for him, it's about proportioning our beliefs to evidence, but he also invokes this really interesting thing if you're a psychology major. If this might be the thing that is interesting to you. I forget the Latin word. I meant to look it up again, but the translation for this Latin word in the text is disease of the ears. So Hume says that the reason that people believe in miracles is because we have this disease of the ears. We love crazy stories. The crazier, the better, right? The least likely, the better, right? We don't want to hear about the mundane, the everyday, right? So he thinks there's a cognitive, psychological element, right, to this belief as well. So some interesting things that we're going to pick up in the readings this week, but we're going to start focusing today just on getting a sense of what could potentially count as a miracle and taking a look at whether or not it can provide support for God's existence, like Richard Swinburne wants to argue. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing. So I have two PowerPoints this week. You'll see one of them is much prettier and newer and still under construction. So that's just a little intro based on an SEP article. So it's got a little bit more background information than the less pretty one, right? But the idea is that, again, right, we're going to be focusing on strong senses of miracles, right? So anything that could just potentially be a coincidence, not something philosophers are going to be taking into consideration here, right? Even if that is the case, it's just not going to provide strong enough evidence, right? They're really going like, what's going to give us reason to believe that not only is God the best explanation, but that God exists because this thing has happened. Okay, so again, violations of laws of nature. And then again, what does that mean to violate a law of nature? Okay, so Christine Overall, of course, is going to say, well, these things apparently are happening all the time. But Richard Swinburne is going to say, no. True miracles do not happen all the time. It is a non-repeatable counter instance, right? So when Richard Swinburne is talking about a miracle or a violation of the law of nature, he's talking about one time, right? So if anyone is claiming that a miracle has happened more than once, it's already not a miracle, okay? Those are not going to be the things that count, right? So like, what are some other ones? Like Jesus showing up on a slice of toast or statues crying, right? There are potentially perfectly good explanations for those things that are already consistent, right, with laws of nature. So these are non-repeatable, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Right. And so this is a place where Swinburne is relying more on scripture than most philosophers would feel comfortable doing. Right. But you'll notice that in his paper, he does not use scriptural examples of miracles. He's going to give you a secular one of like turning on a light switch, right? And something happening in a room next door, right? So he's going to give you examples that don't rely on scripture, but he is definitely going to consider those scriptural instances as strong instances of miracles. Yes. That's good. Right, because Jesus wasn't turning water into wine all the time, right? these things happen one time in very important moments. Good. Okay. So there are some potential problems, right, with understanding a miracle as a violation of a law of nature, right? Notions of laws of nature are newish, right, in terms of the history of human thought. They are credited by coming from René Descartes, a French philosopher and mathematician. But the idea is that, right, people have been believing in God much longer than we've had any sense of laws of nature, right? So it's a little bit weird to hold something counting towards that definition if we're considering something that is claimed to have happened before that definition even existed, right? So for example, I love the if any of you, oh God, what was that movie? I'm forgetting the name, but it was like about the Aztec peoples in Central America. I think Mel Gibson directed it. Sorry, he's the worst.
Apocalypto.
Yes, Apocalypto. Thank you. Right. So there's this amazing, not amazing, it's gruesome scene where they're, sacrificing all of these people that they've captured from the neighboring villages. Right. And they're sacrificing them to the gods, right, to bring about their favor, right, and to make the gods happy. And right before the protagonist is about to have their head cut off, what happens? Sense of laws of nature that could account for that. So of course that seemed like a violation of a law, right? So again, what counts as a violation? What are our laws? Who's determining them? That's all very contextual in terms of what's counted as scientific knowledge at the time, right? So considering how rare, right, solar eclipses are, right? The idea was that this for them was a true violation of the law of nature, right? And Swinburne's also going to give us other criterion that need to be met as well in order for something to count as a miracle. Hume has his own set of criteria, and it's important to know that for Hume, nothing will ever meet that set of criteria. Right? Nothing ever checks all the boxes. That's his skepticism, right? But his biggest critique is, again, psychological. It's about people and the fact that we like to tell tales and we can never get large groups of people to agree on what happened, right? And that's one of his requirements. So yeah, what are we considering to be a violation of a law of nature? What is even a law of nature at this point, right? And then there's also the question of figuring out what the cause was, right? Was it actually God's intervention or something else? Because again, as we talked about with the teleological arguments for God's existence, not everybody sees harmony in the universe, right? A lot of people see chaos. So is every chaotic thing, right, that occurs potentially the will of God, right? Doing these, like the fact that the Earth was hit by a giant asteroid, right? Was that a non-repeatable counter instance? We don't know yet, right? Even if it was consistent with the laws of nature, it seems to satisfy Swinburne's notion, right? It hasn't happened since, right? Good. So, right, how are we actually going to ascribe supernatural agency, right, or responsibility to these events? How can we know who is actually responsible for it? Good. Okay. So now let's go back. Yeah, so if we're looking at the less pretty PowerPoint, right, on slide 6, you can see why we're not going to be using, right, weak notions of the miraculous for this particular argument, but you will see that some of them tend to go along with the notions of intelligent design, right? So the idea is that maybe even our current understanding of like evolution, right? A lot of theists might say that it can't account for the complexity of the human eye. Like it's just so much more complex and so much more amazing than what natural evolution could possibly, provide in that period of time. And again, depends on what you think is possible, right? What do you think is possible given your understanding of the laws of nature versus what is not possible within them? That's going to determine then what you consider to be a miracle, right? Is the evolution of the human eye a miracle, or was it just something that was always possible? Or is it only possible because God had a hand in it, right? So, right, there's lots of different ways we can answer that question. Good. So yeah, you can see there's an example here of like an incurable disease, right? So leukemia, right, does not have a man-made cure, right? We do not have a cure for leukemia. So let's imagine someone's leukemia goes away, right? There are different potential explanations that one could give, right? Natural cure cannot yet be explained, but we can't rule it out, right? So maybe someone just remains agnostic about it, like, oh, I just don't know, right? We just may not know what happened yet. You could think, well, there's no cure that could have occurred, right? So maybe you're just like, nope, I don't even believe a miracle has occurred. They still have leukemia. You could just be in denial of the violation itself. You could think that maybe it was just a misdiagnosis, right? So it's still, I'm not going to let my understanding of the laws of nature be violated. I'm going to say that we were wrong to begin with, right? So in cases of the miraculous, maybe our beginning beliefs were incorrect. And so that's why we can't explain this direct result. Or you could say, right, like the final doctor in this example, that a non-natural cure, right, has come to be, and that the only potential explanation for that would be, right, that's the natural theologian. It's a non-natural explanation. It must be some divine entity, right? Something with omnipotence, right? Something with great power that can override the laws of nature. Okay. So then again, we must ask, right, what exactly does this prove, right? But again, that's going to totally depend on what you think is possible. Okay, so under that condition then, right, sort of anything could be a miracle, depending on what you think is possible, right? So you want to figure out what your understanding is before you dive into these arguments, right? To consider how persuasive they're going to be, right? What exactly is going to constitute a violation enough, be miraculous enough to potentially consider only a non-natural cause, right? Only a supernatural cause. All right. So I don't know. Let me take a break here. Anyone willing to share, even if like, what would it take? What would you have to see to say like, wow, that is a miracle. Like that is a violation of a law of nature. Can't be like a magic show, right? Because we know that that's fake. Those are illusions. Sorry. But what would it take? Well, that's another potential worry, right? Is if you think, again, Christine Overall is going to make this point. If these laws are supposed to govern patterns, then as soon as you violate that law, you've broken it. It's supposed to be a non-breakable law. So if it's broken, then it was never non-breakable to begin with, right? So yeah, it's challenging, right? So what could be considered miraculous in a previous paradigm, right? Like we were saying with that Aztec example, under a new paradigm, not miraculous, right? Yeah. Totally explainable. And this is, again, important. Yeah. If any of you study the history of science, you'll learn about Kuhnian paradigms, right? So this is how we refer to a moment in intellectual
my internet
history.
Connection in the library is unstable. Sorry about that.
No worries. Hopefully you guys are able to hear me okay. But the idea here is that, right, that paradigm kind of governs how most scientists view reality, right? That's their metaphysical picture. So there was a Newtonian revolution, right? They changed the paradigm. And then we had Einstein's paradigm shift, right, with relativity. So this was a shift because it changed our fundamental understandings about what the laws of nature are. So you're absolutely right, right? This is all contextual based on our knowledge. So what is considered miraculous now, we might think would have to withstand paradigm shifts, right? It should be considered miraculous under any paradigm. Like nobody should be able to explain this thing. So do we have anything like that? Can we think, or even if you haven't seen it, can you imagine, like, what would it take? What could satisfy that requirement? my sci-fi brain is like, I'm like trying to think of something like that was so cool, like maybe some sort of like shapeshifter thing. Because I mean, the closest we have in the physical world are like chameleons, but they can't like change their bone structure, like some of the transformative sci-fi characters. I don't know, that seems like a violation of law of nature. I'm not even sure. Here's another crazy thing. I'm not even sure reanimation from death is considered strong miracle anymore because of what we've learned from ocean life. Like how many, aren't there like a couple of species where they're like the phoenixes of the oceans, right? Like they die, they break down to like their basic biological structure and then they regrow, like they come back to life. It might be some sort of octopus or something, but like there are things that do that, right? So maybe even some notion of returning from death is potentially within the realms of possibility within the laws of nature, right? And maybe, yeah, we just don't know it yet, right? So again, these are big questions. These are not easy questions, right? But they're important to consider. All right, so right, taking this into consideration, right, an event that takes place which violates the laws of nature is always going to be a highly improbable event. Okay, but so for Swinburne, it's not just going to be proving, right? Because like someone pointed out, I think Tori pointed out, you can't always prove that the miracle has occurred, right? Or prove that that thing has happened. But if you're going to be justified in believing that, you need to at least have some evidence that a law of nature has been violated. And you also have to have evidence that that violation was due to divine intervention. Okay, so for him, it's not just going to be enough for the law to have been violated potentially. You also have to have reason to believe that there was divine intervention, right? So there's got to be some meaning behind it, right? Some purpose. Again, a little teleological there, right? There's got to be some intent. It can't just be like, yeah, maybe you've seen something happen that seemed miraculous, but like it didn't affect anybody. Like these things are not going to count, right? Because a personal God would not intervene, right? If not for a particular reason. Okay. So starting with the first criterion, right? How can we justifiably believe that a law of nature has been violated? Well, he argues that future predictions can always nullify a law, right? Because again, we can always think that the law should be updated, as we talked about. Potentially there's new information, right? And the reason that we like laws of nature, the reason that they're useful is because they make predictions, right? So the idea is that if you're using, this is just science, right? If you're using a law or theory, right? You make a prediction, you have your hypothesis, and then whether or not that hypothesis confirms or disconfirms, right? Whether or not the prediction aligns or not with what actually happens is going to be reason to support the law or not, right? So of course, this is going to have to be, right, something that is on the whole always operating as it should. So when an event violates a law of nature, the appearance may simply be that no one has thought of the law that could explain that event, right? So he's already acknowledging that. He is acknowledging that there are things that could appear as if they are violations of laws of nature, but in fact, it could just be a hole in our understanding, right? So he is smartly enough recognizing that, right? So what can we say then is going to count as a true violation, right? Not something that is just going to require us to switch paradigms and update our law. And for him, that's going to be lack of repeatability and lack of natural explanation. Okay, so if we're going to think that something is a true violation, we have to say that it's not repeatable, right? And that we cannot think of any possible natural explanation for it. Right? So for that last one, I think of like the ghost hunters type shows, right? Where they're like, okay, someone's claiming to have paranormal phenomena in their house. So we're going to make sure it's not like an electrical signal, right? We're going to process some elimination, right? Try and rule out any natural explanation for those things, right? So that's the obvious one, right? But that lack of repeatability, again, is going to mean that even for Swinburne, most things that people refer to as miraculous, not going to be the things that he's counting, right, as potential evidence for God's existence. Okay, so miracles are events that seem to then, right, not only be not repeatable and lack a physical explanation or a natural explanation, but they seem to have deeper significance than the events themselves, right? So this is leading into then the indication of some sort of intelligence. If a god intervened in the natural order to make a feather land here rather than there, for instance, that would serve no deep ultimate purpose. These events would not naturally be described as miracles. So again, we not only have to establish that a violation has occurred by lack of repeatability, lack of natural explanation, but we also need to show that there is some evidence for direction, right? That thing was done with agency for a reason. So to review, right, has to be a violation of a law, lack of repeatability, lack of natural explanation. And then the second one, right, the violation, we need to have some reason to think that it was due to divine intervention, right? And what that means is that this can be shown with sufficient circumstantial evidence for an intelligent agent. How do we do that? Right? This is where he relies on other rules of inferential reasoning, right? And so he introduces the notion of the principle of credulity, which is that the world is as we experience it to be, right? So that means that if you experience something that seems to be directed, like for a purpose, then you should believe that to be the case, right? So he's arguing that you should, on the whole, trust your experience, right? There's a credulity, a reliability, right, in most of our experiences. Again, on the whole. Of course, we're fallible, right? But on the whole, right, we can trust what our experience tells us. Now, of course, this principle would be criticized because it can't necessarily, on its own, just prove that God exists. Because just as much as people claim to have religious experience, there are lots of people who claim not to have religious experiences, right? So those people would be just as rational, right, then to conclude that no God exists, right? That they have a godless world that they live in. So he responds to this by stating that the principle of credulity does not apply to experiences of absences. So you can sort of think of this like the way you argue for what's it called in the court of law? Who has the burden of proof, right? So we're familiar with this concept, right? Burden of proof. Who has the burden of proof in the court of law? Prosecution or defense, right? So the idea is that the burden lies on proving a positive claim, right? And this is typically the case in philosophy as well, right? If we're talking about existence, we say, who does the burden of proof land on? The theists or the atheists, right? And so here, the burden too would land on the theists. They're making the positive ontological claim that something does exist. So Swinburne is using this burden to support this critique. Then he says, just like the burden of proof is on the theists, the principle of credulity only applies to positive experiences, right? Instances of something existing or happening, not instances of things not happening, right? So perhaps you've heard people say this, like a lack of evidence is not evidence for something, right? So we have to look at what we do have evidence for. So he's saying that the principle of credulity doesn't work equally for theists and atheists, right? In the case of religious experience, it only works for experiences of things, not experiences not of things, right? So making a little bit of a distinction there. Okay, the next principle he advocates for is the principle of testimony, right? So just like he thinks it's reasonable to trust our experiences, thinks it's reasonable to believe that the experiences of others are probably as they say they are. Now, I might be a little too skeptical for this, but I'm going to do my best to defend this idea. And the idea, I think, is right in the sense that most of our knowledge does come from testimony, right? We don't experience most of what we know firsthand, right? Most of the things we know about the world we get from what we consider to be reliable sources, right? Even if those are sources on the interwebs, right? Whether it's friends, family, people we know, people we don't know, people with expertise, people without expertise, right? We are constantly relying on the testimony of others. So there's some interesting, philosophical questions about that. So like if you were, let's say you just got off a bus in a brand new city, right? And you ask somebody for directions to the beach. Hey, you are trusting the testimony that this person is giving you. And if that testimony is correct, we can say, well, then did you know how to get to the beach? Or were you just borrowing that knowledge from somebody else? Right. So like there's all these questions then of how knowledge is transferred via testimony, right? Does simply hearing the testimony of others bestow their knowledge upon you, right? Because this is the other question about miracles. Maybe it's the case that you experiencing a miracle is reason for you to believe in God, but it might not be reason enough for other people to believe in God, right? So again, what role does testimony play in knowledge, right? Is it something that can be transferred? And so here he's giving us reason to think that we can receive knowledge through testimony, that we have good reason to trust, right? So the principle of testimony, though, of course, can be criticized because people are often prone to hyperbole, right? We exaggerate. Again, think of Hume, disease of the ears. We like to keep people's attention, right? And maybe you've even seen this or done this midway. You're like telling a story and you realize it's not landing, so you change it up a little bit, make it a little more exciting, right? Whatever it is, that sort of idea there. So we might think that the stories of the miraculous are just maybe things people do to get attention, or one of the other, again, many psychological motivations for telling tall tales. It's also difficult for people to accept the principle of testimony. Again, for lack of empirical evidence, because we can't always trust that what people are telling us is actually true, in the sense that they too might be mistaken about what they experienced, right? So even if you're like, well, I believe you believe that, right? Like, I believe you think that that's what's happened to you. But again, we might think that even if they're relaying what to them is an accurate representation of their experience, that might still not, again, be enough to justify your belief, right, based on their experience. And again, if we're thinking about testimony in terms of knowledge bestowal, all scripture is testimony, right? All of it. It's all stories relayed, passed down through generations, right? And so this question has big implications, right, on what we can rationally believe based on the testimony of others. Okay, but of course, then we could say, right, maybe one needs to fall back on something else. Maybe we don't need reason or rationality or some sort of like sufficient evidence bar being met. Maybe this is then where things like faith come into play, right? Maybe then it's a matter of like, okay, I have to decide right now whether or not I'm going to believe what you just told me. I have no evidence one way or the other, right? So you're going to have to just kind of go on faith, whichever way you go, right? And so this is, again, not so much like not giving a justification, but saying in reality, this is where a lot of us end up, right? Most of us, we receive the testimony, we don't have enough external evidence otherwise. And so we are put in this place, right, where we have to then make a decision. And so the question then, is that decision rational? So Swinburne understands that miracles, right, to be acts of God, would involve God actually interfering with its own creation, right? So there are already some potential issues Swinburne is aware of with the notion of miracles, right? So for example, God gave us free will. So if God intervenes, maybe not just in a law of nature, but intervenes in people's decisions, right? Their agency, like someone fires a bullet, right? And the bullet freezes. I don't know. That's a violation of a law of nature, right? Just freezes midair. Unless you're like in a D&D world and there's like one of those gel cube things that it got stuck, right? Again, in this world, these laws, right? That would be a violation. So then we have to ask, well, okay, is God then interfering in other things as well as laws of nature when God invokes miracles? Is God then potentially overriding things like our free will? Right, so some other potential worries too, but he's trying to give us just reasonable belief. Just reasonable belief. So he's not aiming for proof here necessarily of God's existence, though he does think that according to inference to the best explanation, if you have reasonable belief that God is the explanation, then that's the best, and so it's probably true, right? But we're really just arguing for reasonable belief here. And so for that reason, he thinks what we're going to see as Hume's criteria, which I said there were a lot and nobody meets it, right? He says that's too high. You're setting the bar too high. If that's the requirement for knowledge, we know nothing. Like that's just too high. Most of our knowledge, again, comes from testimony. And again, he's trying to be practical about the way we actually get knowledge and the way we actually come to form beliefs. And he wants to say that most of our beliefs are justified. So we shouldn't, right, place that barrier too high. So he's going to be replacing this justification criteria with the principles of credulity and the principles of testimony. Okay, we can trust what we experience. We can, in general, trust what other people tell us, even if they're mistaken, right? Again, is that on the whole, we want to think that people are relaying the truth. And again, this might depend on how optimistic or pessimistic you are about human nature. How, like, do you think people lie a lot? I am more pessimistic, but you guys are young. They're not as jaded as I am yet. So hopefully you think that that's the case. All right. So one thing that's going to follow from this, though, is that Swinburne's arguments will allow us to justifiably believe our own experiences of miracles and the testimony of other experiences. Okay, so this reasoning, because of the principles of credulity, which justifies our experience, the principles of testimony, it's going to justify our belief in other people's experience. But again, only if it's a non-repeatable counter instance. Okay, if someone is attributing a repeatable instance as a miracle, you can say, sure, that thing happened, but it's not a miracle. Right? So first it has to meet those criteria. Then if you want to be reasonable in believing it, right, you can either trust your experience or the testimony of others. So you can get that source of knowledge from either place. And as you will see going forward, that's not going to be the case for all philosophers. They're definitely going to say we're going to need maybe a higher bar when it comes to the testimony of others. Hume in particular is going to say that. Hume is going to say you should always prioritize your personal experience over other people's. Right? So even if everybody else tells you that they had another experience, right? You might think, well, that's reason that I should doubt mine. Not according to Hume. Hume says you should always trust your experience over others. So again, different intuitions. We're going to take a look at all of them. All right. So we have last few minutes. I did go again, we did a little overview, but we'll be diving into overall and Hume more on Thursday. But so any questions before I let you guys go today? Oh, Hume is what we call a moderate skeptic and an extreme empiricist or a radical empiricist, right? So for Hume, the only things that we can have knowledge of are things that we experience. We have to compare our experiences to all of our other experiences. So the example he's going to give, again, it's like proportionality, like comparing like a ratio, finding out the percentage. So if you have like one experience of a miracle happening, but every other day of your life, your experiences have been of no miracles happening, right? You should doubt the miracle experience, right? Not the rest of the experiences, right? So the idea is that we're always going to be purporting it that way. So sometimes he's going to say we ought to doubt what we are experiencing in the moment, right? Even if you're like, well, I haven't taken any drugs, like I'm not in a space that's, made of optical illusions, all these things, right? Even then, if you experience something that goes against all of your previous experience, he will tell you to doubt it. All experience. Oh yeah, that a principle, like, is a rule, an ideal, something we're trying to aim for. Faith specifically refers to belief without evidence. We're going to talk about faith and whether or not it's rational to have faith in things, and specifically faith in God. And so I'm not going to get ahead of us, but that's a fun conversation. Okay, so then with that, in the last 2 minutes, I was right, at least according to Swinburne, right? Because not only would we have to be able to prove a violation of a law of nature, but we have to prove intelligent design, right? And so if that type of being is inclined towards violating a law of nature here and now, that's very not deistic, right? Deistic gods do not interfere. Our charitable version is not that he's apathetic or that this being is apathetic, but as we'll see, the idea is that there are potentially two different ways we can will things to happen, right? We can directly will them to happen, or we can allow them to happen because we are willing something greater, right? And so the idea is that, yeah, a deistic God might just continue to
For
allow
the,
things to happen because it's in service of the larger will. I mean, deism serves a lot of purposes, right? It can be an answer to a lot of the problems that
yeah,
come up with a personalized God. Especially when, yeah, even just in the cosmological argument, right? We were talking about whether or not God is in space and time or outside of it, right? Deism, placing God outside of space and time, alleviates some worries, right, about that infinite regress stuff. So, yeah,
yeah,
deism can be handy to address a lot of philosophical problems.
all right.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, guys. Well, that's our time. I will see you all on Thursday. Have a good week.